years after the creation of the United States, the lack of equitable access to housing remains a top concern in communities across the country. What if, at this pivotal moment, we viewed housing as a public good rather than a commodity to be bought, sold, and invested in? All of today's speakers are working to bring about a new vision of our housing system that would provide homes for everyone, especially and including oppressed and marginalized communities. You're going to learn from some very experienced organizers today, and I'm incredibly excited for the conversation. We're going to jump right in and get started first with Greg. Greg, please take it away.
All right, thanks. I am glad to be able to share today, and I've got a few slides that hopefully you can see there. Let me make them into a slideshow. Well, this may not work quite like I wanted. Let's see. Let me try this one more time. All right, my apologies for the slight delay here. One more time. Here we go. All right, so one of my jobs here is to just give us a little quick history lesson on the United States housing market as it has developed. And so I'm going to give us just a quick flash through about 100 years of housing history, beginning with the Great Depression. So, among the earliest interventions in President Roosevelt's New Deal programs was resetting the housing market in 1932 or 33 when he came into office. 50% of mortgages were near foreclosure. So that the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, came to rescue those bad mortgages, and the FHA was created, the Federal Housing Administration, to write new mortgages for new homeowners. The goal was to democratize wealth by democratizing homeownership. This was one of the first and most important pieces of the New Deal. In 1942, FDR, in a speech to the U.S. Savings and Loan League, said that a nation of homeowners, of people who own a real share in their own land, is unconquerable. Now, to a certain extent, this worked. Homeownership was at about 43% of homes in the year 1930. By 1980, 66% of Americans own their homes. But the gains, as you probably know, were not distributed equally. Thanks to sort of the generalized culture of white supremacy and anti-black racism, but also thanks to specific practices, including most famously the redlining maps of the HOLC, which were mimicked by the FHA. And those maps, quite importantly, were not only public policy, but became standard private policy in the practices of banks and other lending institutions. Um, so those interventions did not work all the way. And in 1949, the federal government passed another Housing Act. The Housing Act of 1949, President Truman said, establishes as a national objective the achievement as soon as feasible of a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. So not everybody had experienced the rising tide that followed FDR. So to get at that, I want to give you a quick case study. But first, let's demystify what we mean by this term commodity. A commodity is simply an economic good that has the characteristic of being fungible or interchangeable. So that means that the commodity source or where it comes from, how it was produced, tends not to matter. So common examples of commodities are flour or corn or oil or gold or iron ore, unless you are extremely picky as a gourmand, perhaps, then the source of those things tend not to make much difference. Importantly, commodities develop markets around them that are independent of the goods themselves. So another way of saying that is that corn has value to people because they eat it or they use it to feed their livestock, but it has value to investors because it can be turned into a financial instrument for making money in a market. And it's those layers of abstraction that really define commodity in its common practice, common use of that term. So here's a map from 1953 that'll help us to get at this map of downtown Charlotte to get at what we mean by commodity. So this is the former Brooklyn neighborhood, historic black neighborhood here in Charlotte that is the site of much of our work and the site of much reflection within this community. You can see these four blocks, and the ones at the top left and on the bottom probably look like a sort of a typical southern city neighborhood. Then you can see the block at the top right where someone has built these old Sanborn maps you may not see very well, but we've packed into a single block an extra alley, and all of those homes are duplexes. And so you can see the distinct difference between the shape of the balance of these four blocks, the other three, but then this smaller one where we've built lots of very small homes built prior to the advent of housing, minimum housing codes. And so most of these historically shared a single bathroom across a duplex, usually located on the back porch. So that's what it looked like on the map. Here's what it looked like on the street. This is from that same alley that you saw there. And you can see that these homes are not extraordinarily well put together. They are built for profit. They are built as a cheap investment to be rented to a politically powerless group of people who don't have any other options but to live in them. Um, and so the Observer, our newspaper here at the beginning of urban renewal, which resulted from that 1949 Housing Act, um, featured that little block right there. You can see the hint of that picture in a very low resolution format with the headline, Brooklyn Homes Give Owners High Returns. So here is a good example from our history of housing being used as a commodity for its exchange value rather than its use value. Um, I'm not going to blow up that, but instead I will tell you what it says. Um, for one, inside the Brooklyn neighborhood during Jim Crow, in the Jim Crow South here in 1960, there were only 7% of residents were homeowners. So while the rest of the country was at about 50%, it was 7% in that neighborhood. One typical landlord's business that article profiles, he held 41 units. Those units together, altogether, had a replacement value of about $85,000. So they could be built for about $2,000 a piece. The annual rental income that he made on those units was about $20,000. And his annual tax bill was about $825. So this is I think, a pretty extreme example, but one that reflects the reality that was faced in a lot of cities around the country where a significant landowner could make a quick profit and a lot of profit for a very small investment. And so there you go, housing as a commodity. Notably, when the Brooklyn neighborhood was torn down by urban renewal. It was declared to be a slum, but in the moral code that capitalism gives us, exploitative profit is always superior to the claim of those who are poor. And so the last bit of that article says that this comparison, comparing it with a higher value neighborhood, does not take into consideration the underlying health and moral problems which have made the term slum almost a dirty word. You can look around in the other documentation from that time and see that people who were poor were the ones who had the low moral codes, and the people who were exploiting them for their money in the form of rent were not the ones that had those low moral codes. So those homes get packed in, and then when urban renewal happens within that neighborhood, it's the first urban renewal project in the in the state of North Carolina. Nationally, there were 2,500 projects across 1,200 municipalities that destroyed 568 square miles of American built environment. That's the island of Manhattan 25 times over. There were several million people displaced, but when those projects happened, it was landowners that were bought out. There were few rental relocation assistance payments until almost 20 years into the program. And so again, that sort of gives you the what how culturally homes and home ownership were viewed. If you owned the home, you got some money out of it. But otherwise, the home was considered an investment vehicle whose primary monetary value existed for the person who claimed the deed for it, but not the people who lived in those spaces. I wanted to jump forward briefly, and somebody had to keep me track on time here. But another quick example um, of housing being used as a commodity that's a little closer to our day is the 2007-2008 housing crisis that we called the Great Recession. That was led up to by the proliferation of subprime mortgages. Those were mortgages that had very low down payments. They had adjustable interest rates that went up within a couple of years, and they often have balloon payments that were due at the end of those years. So in other words, you could get in cheap, but then home ownership became extremely expensive about 4 or 5, 6 years into your mortgage, and that meant that many people foreclosed on their homes. Those subprime mortgages in particular were marketed heavily to black borrowers. And those borrowers faced far higher foreclosure rates than white borrowers did around the country. By the end of that Great Recession, black Americans had lost 56% of their net worth, compared with only 18% for white Americans. Again, this was enabled not only because of subprime mortgages, but because of the financial instrument that was coupled with so many of those subprime mortgages that were called mortgage-backed securities. In short, a lender would write a mortgage, but then sell off that mortgage to someone else. And the this all gets complicated, more complicated than I can understand, but sometimes somebody else would sell off those packages into further packages of securities. And so mortgages became fungible. They nearly lost their attachment to the real estate that they were attached to. They were just dollars that could be traded around for the purpose of making profit, of exploiting market opportunities. But because many of those mortgages were connected to subprime lending, eventually, as those foreclosures started, then it affected the entire economy. Again, inside the moral logic of capitalism here in the United States, it was the bailouts that went to the Wall Street banks who had participated in all that risky behavior, and not to the homeowners and the neighborhoods and the cities that were being destabilized by these practices. Um, so these sorts of practices continue even in our affordable housing space. The low-income housing tax credit program that has funded so many units around the country even encourages us to use that language, units, right? This is what we're trying to produce. We're trying to produce units, something that is fungible, that is easily traded. Here in Charlotte, we have some other neoliberal solutions, including a housing trust fund that provides gap funding for affordable housing developers. That is, when they can't get enough debt, then we'll provide them some tax money to help out. Or we have a large private investment fund comprised or is funded by many people who like to pat themselves on the back about their good work that is aimed at rehabbing older homes. But these solutions are not solving for the problem of abundant housing or neighborhood stability. They're really solving for the problem of profit. Their primary goal is to serve as an investment vehicle that has the added benefit of creating some housing, But first and foremost, the profit is what matters. So they're failing to solve our toughest affordability problems. And I would encourage you all to check out Redress's recent paper published about how um, these these sorts of investments don't serve the communities that need them the worst, the working class that the portions of the working class that need them the worst. And often they tend to recreate spatial segregation patterns across our cities. So I suspect that I'm probably out of time now. Kashana, is that right?
I was going to let you keep going, Greg. You're doing great, but
All
feel
right.
free to wrap up.
All right. So I'll tell you briefly that our work here in Charlotte has included trying to address some of these things directly and indirectly. We are nearing the end now of a campaign against one of our hospital systems here. And that campaign is on the small scale, what we want on the large scale, which is that public and semi-public organizations create inclusive neighborhoods that create opportunity across class and across race for healthier neighborhoods and a healthier city. We are demanding good land use policy that repairs historic harms and creates opportunities for economically and racially diverse communities. Not because those communities are perfect necessarily, but because they tend to create the best um, social and economic outcomes for people. One example of that recently is the efforts to expand a highway here that we've gotten temporarily stopped, but it looks like we're going to have to continue fighting highway expansion. And then supporting some community-led housing work, including our local community land trust and a partner organization called Action and See here that's begun organizing for social housing investments from our city and our county. So I'll pause with that because now we get to hear about some community land trust work and then some social housing work.
Thanks so much, Greg. Just doing my job for me. I really appreciate that. So, thank you for that background and history and sharing how sort of what we're doing with our current housing system is not working for Charlotteans. So, we're next going to move over to Luis, who is exactly as Greg mentioned, going to share with us the ways in which community land trusts work in this space. Luis?
Awesome. Thank you all so much again for inviting me here. And thank you, Greg, for your presentation. I think, giving me food for thought and also just great context for why we do what we do now. So I'll go ahead and share my screen for my piece. And it's like we're on. Awesome. So again, my name is Luis Oyola. I am Executive Director of the Piedmont Community Land Trust. We are based in Charlottesville, Virginia region. We serve the city of Charlottesville and the surrounding rural counties. Um, and I've been in this role since 2023, and we've just seen a lot of great growth, and yeah, excited to share. So, all right. So community land trust, the basic way that it works, it's one of a variety of ownership models that are usually referred to as shared equity housing or shared equity ownership. And what's being shared is that for every property that's in the community land trust, the every one of our buyers buys the home. They gain title to it. They can pass it on to their heirs. Um, Everything that comes with ownership comes with the purchase of the home. But they lease the land from the community land trust, and in that sense, the community land trust retains ownership of the land in perpetuity. Actually, the leases for our homeowners and for virtually all community land trusts in the United States are 90-year or 99-year renewable lease. And during that time, the owners pay a small monthly fee to the community land trust. In our case, it's $25 a month. And that's really it. That's how the community land trust works. But there's a lot under it and a lot of history behind as to the why of that structure. Um, at its core, when it comes to housing, that shared equity model makes the housing permanently affordable because the fact that there are two titles to the property means that it's really hard for those individual owners of the home to go and sell the home at market value or just do other things that would otherwise um, make the risk the loss of that affordable housing. Um, so when they sell, our ground lease makes it so that the house price that they bought it at can appreciate, but only up to a certain point, with the idea or the hope that that point is still affordable to the next person after they are ready to sell. We retain ownership of the land every time the home resells, and the next person, which in our case always has to be another low-income buyer, enters into the same terms, and that's sort of revolved over time. Those are the basic mechanics of a community land trust. This model is applied to all kinds of settings. It's not just housing, but particularly in the US, because housing is such a deep and urgent issue, the vast majority of CLTs are focused on housing and specifically home ownership. A little bit of history to contextualize community land trust. So the first organization that laid the foundation for community land trust in the United States was called New Communities Incorporated. They were founded in 1969 in rural Georgia. They were founded by a coalition of white activists and Black farmers and Black civil rights leaders. And who were trying to tackle this very specific issue in the region where after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, a growing number of white landowners would buy up parcel by parcel Black farmland, increase the cost of farming on those lands, and use that as a way to push Black people out of their districts. So is using that commodification of land as a way to disenfranchise Black voters, since they could no longer do it through state law. They ended up bringing in, I think, up to 5,000 acres of Black farmland into the ownership of New Communities Incorporated, and in that way protected that farmland, because that parcel by parcel speculative approach was no longer possible. Through that community ownership, they also introduced what are today called charrettes, just this idea where entities or developers such as New Communities Incorporated actually bring communities together to figure out how to design what is available in the community, the assets of the community, design them together. They were very ahead of their time in terms of how things are done today by planners and architects. Moving further north into the early 80s in Boston, people of the Dudley Street neighborhood in South Boston organized in the early 80s against illegal dumping in their neighborhood. So there were all these vacant lots where businesses, in order to avoid garbage disposal fees, would just dump their trash in abandoned lots in these neighborhoods at this time. And still, this neighborhood was predominantly Cape Verdean, Black American, working class white, and Puerto Rican. Through the organizing that those residents did, the city of Boston actually exercised eminent domain over those vacant illegal dumping sites and transferred them to a community entity, which was then called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And there was community land trusts at that time were starting to pick up, so they decided to use the community land trust model to preserve the community's access and control over those vacant properties and have developed them over time into what is currently Boston's only affordable homeownership community, because of that preservation and that community control. So it become a really great example. And today they maintain actually a board that represents the demographics of the neighborhood. So they have reserved seat for Cape Verdeans, they have reserved seats for Black Americans, reserved seats for white Americans, and reserved seats for Hispanic, which are mostly Puerto Ricans in that neighborhood. And they actually have a youth council also. And the way that where the community land trust really comes in is that the community land trust, in this case, is actually a separate organization. And so, but they act as the developer, and they are accountable to the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative as the community control organization. This next example of a community land trust, this picture is from Puerto Rico. This is the Caño Martín Peña. Is that string of trees you see going down the middle is the Caño, the channel, and it divides 8 informal settlements of Puerto Rico in San Juan, just outside of the tourist area. These 8 informal settlements are called as, officially recognized as a G8. But they are 8 informal settlements that were established by working class Puerto Ricans in the 40s and 50s, who were displaced from agricultural lands, big part because of colonialism, and started these communities with zero infrastructure and have been historically neglected by the government. In the early 2000s, the government wanted to dredge that channel, and that dredging would have required mass displacement of a lot of these communities. And so they used the Dudley Street connection as an example, and demanded that the government transfer the entirety of those informal settlements into a community land trust. And they were successful in doing that. And that has enabled the communities to literally act collectively in ensuring that there's no displacement, so that as the channel has been getting dredged, which started about 3 years ago, anyone who absolutely needs to be displaced is still able to stay within the neighborhood with a guarantee of returning. And that has added benefits to where the community has now been able to collectively advocate and organize for better infrastructure. People can gain title to their homes. Just overall improvements to the community, but on the community's terms. This mural here in the picture says, and for the first time, us residents were agents of our own future. It's a very inspiring example. Actually, Puerto Rico has been used as an example for informal settlements across the world now. Back to PCLT, we are in partnership with the main affordable housing developer of the Charlottesville region, Piedmont Housing Alliance, and where we leverage a lot of PHA's development and homeownership counseling tools, but the PCLT is still the community land trust for the region. To give you a sense of what we've done physically, we've partnered with Habitat. That's the Habitat for Humanity. That's the project on the top left, where Habitat owners go through the regular Habitat process. They get their mortgages, which are great, but that home remains affordable through the CLT ownership. On the top middle, this house is in the Belmont neighborhood of Charlottesville, and is an example of the CLT acquiring an existing home and then reselling it at a lower price and preserving that affordability over time. And actually, I think this home is a great example because that deck, the fence, the garden you see, that was all that homeowner. So we don't, even though we quote own the land, we don't tell the owners what to do with the land. The ground lease is really a mechanism for preserving the affordability. On the top right, this is actually the CLT leading development. And you can see those homes which are also in the Belmont neighborhood in Charlottesville. has solar panels. And in this case, we invested and fundraised for making these net zero homes, and so that these homeowners actually pay zero in electricity. These were, in fact, the first certified net zero homes that were actually affordable in all of the US. And in the bottom right, this is an example of a very typical suburban subdivision, where a major developer, in this case Stanley Martin, um, built a 100-unit neighborhood and set aside 21 homes for the CLT. It's a very market-friendly approach, like Greg broke down, but it's actually been, in terms of sheer number of homes, this has been our fastest way to grow. Like I said, we're in the Charlottesville region, but to contextualize of the Charlottesville region, as of this year, the region that you see here on this map is the most expensive housing market in all of Virginia, which is stunning considering that we are comparing to Northern Virginia, right outside of DC, where there are way more people, and the housing is really expensive there too. Charlottesville is still less affordable than Northern Virginia as of this year. As to why, like I said, Greg already gave some great context on this, but Charlottesville does have a prominent example of how urban renewal drove this commodification of housing and the displacement of Black people. So on the left, you see an aerial shot of the historically Black neighborhood of Vinegar Hill. In the early 1960s, an all-white city council declared this a, quote, slum, and used that as justification to displace the Black residents. But when it comes to actual ownership, like Greg said, just like in Charlotte, the majority of the landlords were white. There was a lot of Black home ownership and a lot of Black business ownership, but the majority of landlords were white, and it was their properties that the city used as justification for saying this was a slum. On the right is what that region looks like today. Half of the area is an office building and an Omni hotel. And actually sat vacant for decades. It's only now that construction is happening. Moving on to another historical Black neighborhood that is particularly relevant to the Piedmont Community Land Trust is the Fifeville neighborhood. This is the northern edge, so along the top of this blue line is the historic part of the neighborhood, and it's just across the train tracks from where Vinegar Hill was. This neighborhood has faced heavy gentrification pressure because of its proximity to the UVA hospital. So you can just barely see a big building on the top center that's just a portion of the UVA hospital. It's gigantic. And a lot of doctors, a lot of UVA folks have moved into that neighborhood and priced low-income Black, like mostly homeowners, out. And the Community Land Trust has currently 9 homes in that neighborhood. 2 of them through a Habitat partnership. Those were the 2 earliest homes in that neighborhood. And there wasn't a whole lot of growth until we partnered with PHA and then sold between 2023 and 2024 5 vacant duplexes that were rehabbed. And in that one, we had a very intentional partnership with Black-led organizations in Fifeville, and in order to completely sell those homes outside of the public listings and make sure that, you know, the fundraising and the investment made into rehabbing these homes stayed with people in the community. And then just last year, another home in the same street as those was rehabbed and resold below market value as a ninth. And then our 9th home was just sold last April, and this was our first successful rent to own, which is a effort we're trying to pilot where people who are not quite there in terms of being mortgage ready can still stay in a home as tenants, but in that time, do what they need to do to get ready. We set aside a portion of their rent into a sort of savings within PHA, and that also buys us time to do the fundraising necessary to meet the sales price that's affordable to them. Of those those 9 homes we've sold, and 7 went to Black heads of household. Actually, as a CLT right now, 40% of our homeowners are Black, which is as a percentage is much higher than homeownership rate for Charlottesville. I won't go too deep into these, but just know that these were the earliest homes in that neighborhood, and they were sold below market value. As you can see, market value at that time was very low because it hadn't been gentrified as much. But I wanted to talk more about these. These were the other 7 homes on Prospect Avenue. So the 5 vacant duplexes I first talked about, when they were sold in 2024, their value ranged between 280 and 310. We were able to sell them at between 155 and 177. And that is, again, with full rehab. These also had solar panels, which is the electricity bills. And all of that investment is kept out of market speculation through the community land trust model because we're able to cap that resale price through the ground lease. In 2025, last year, the home we sold at 715 was valued at 305. We sold that for 240. Not as low as the other 5, and that simply because we just weren't able to raise as much money for that one. That remains our biggest barrier for reaching deeper affordability. We were able to raise more money for the next home in 701, which was that rent to own. We sold that one for 180. To put some numbers behind the model, this is one of those Fifield homes on Nunley Street, one of those Habitat homes. So market value when it was originally sold was 176, and it was sold at 135. Now, this home hasn't resold, so we don't have an appraised value to really compare. So I use tax assessed values, which is in Charlottesville typically lower than market appraised value. But you can still see the pattern where as the appraised value goes up to, as of 2026, 245, applying our resale formula to that appreciation would raise the sales price to 152, which is just something you don't see for a 3-bedroom home in Charlottesville, period. Not even close. The median sales price for Charlottesville right now is 465 for comparison. So there's some appreciation happening, but our idea, our theory is that that appreciation doesn't need to happen at a rate that locks other people out. What you see in this picture is a proposed development called The Mark. It is for University of Virginia students, and it's all market rate. Even though the city has an affordability requirement now, they have a carve out for student housing. So all of this is market rate. It's rented out by the bedroom, not by the apartment. So it makes it much harder for families to plan to live in those. And it is right along that northern edge, so that is that historic edge of the neighborhood. To the left of the proposed building is actually the First Baptist Church. That is the oldest Black congregation in Charlottesville, and it will be sort of looming over. This proposed development will loom over that church. The community has been very outspoken against this development, but part of what's happening is that the city recently upzoned the entire city to remove exclusionary single-family zoning, which was actually originally created as a way to maintain segregation, keeping Black people from developing denser and more affordable housing. The upzoning removed that exclusionary zoning, but introduced all this by right zoning that allows for-profit developers to build these massive, expensive homes that will then drive up speculation, drive up taxes for homeowners, Black families that have already been displaced, if not are at risk of displacement. So that's where the community land trust stands today in terms of like a challenge to the community. We work hand in hand with the neighborhood association, and many community members see us as sort of the alternative because we're able to provide housing, provide ownership, but we're able to guarantee that these homes will be affordable in the future. But with some challenges are still there. Number one, where does the money and the land comes from? In the absence of government taking the land. So I'm just checking messages. We rely on people's goodwill, and a lot of our homes we've gotten them because people were willing to donate or give us a good deal, but that still relies on goodwill. And then the money, like the construction is expensive, period. There's no getting around it. And so that money has to come from somewhere. And right now, at least for Charlottesville, at cost construction is well above the prices that are affordable to our potential buyers. So even if we're cutting profit from it, it's still too expensive. Then there's pressures of the real estate market. And this is particularly true in my role, where in order to make homes happen, I have to work on the terms of certain developers, certain builders. I have to work with realtors, appraisers, et cetera, et cetera. And that puts a certain pressure on us to conform to how the market works. And so the dance is always like, how can we do that just enough so that we can meet our mission without compromising the actual history and the context of community land trust. This is also a very urgent issue. People need housing yesterday. And in order for this to work right, we need deep relationship building, and that requires time. So that's always a constant dance. And finally, there's understanding and trust of the model. I think that this is growing because of the urgency. People trust and understand the model work, they see it work. But I will just name that there's a particular trend in Black and just broadly speaking, non-white communities of a distrust of anyone other than themselves owning the land, which is completely understandable and something that, like in my place, I try to simply be patient with. And if people can achieve home ownership that way, great. Because yes, when other people own the land, historically, that very bad things have happened. And so it's on. I feel like the onus is on us to gain the trust and really show that we're a tool for the community rather than developer or entity trying to impose ourselves. And that's it. I'll let it give time for the next person and stop sharing.
Thanks so much, Louise. So before moving on to our final speaker, I do want to encourage everyone to continue to please submit questions for our panelists using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We're going to do our best to answer as many as we can. You could also feel free to use the chat as well. So now we're going to move over to Tara for some perspective from renters and tenants. We've been focused and kind of heard a lot about home ownership and affordable paths to home ownership, but we're going to shift a bit and really talk about how and where tenant unions are envisioning and achieving a future where income and this idea of property ownership don't limit the ability to have homes. So we're really excited to hear from you, Tara. Thank you.
Thanks, Kashana. Thanks, Greg and Luis, for your presentations. I was busily taking notes on the side, so thank you for the mid-afternoon education. My name is Tara Raghuveer, and I am the director of the Tenant Union Federation, aka TUF, and I'll tell you more about TUF in just a second. But I want to start by just stating the obvious, that the rent is too damn high, and it's been too damn high for too damn long. And most people who rent their homes are currently paying more rent than they've ever paid for the worst conditions they've ever endured. And there's so many stats I could rattle off on this front, but I'll spare you because I think everyone on this call is very familiar with this reality. The more time I spend out in the field with our base across the country, in every nook and cranny of the country, it's clear to me, and it's clear to all of us, something has got to give. Things cannot continue this way. Something has got to give. The question is not whether tenants revolt. The question is whether that revolt is from a place of desperation or from a place of power. And that's why the Tenant Union Federation exists. We see it as our job to ensure the latter, that the tenant revolt that at this point feels inevitable is from a place of power. So the Tenant Union Federation, aka TUF, is a union, it's a national union of tenant unions organizing to establish tenants as a political and economic class that cannot be ignored. We were founded in 2024 by 5 founding locals, Casey Tenants, which is the tenant union I helped to build in Kansas City, Missouri, Connecticut Tenants, Kentucky Tenants, Southside Together on the south side of Chicago, and Bozeman Tenants in Bozeman, Montana. As you might be able to tell, we were not founded on the basis of some kind of geographic through line. In fact, those 5 locals are pretty geographically random, but there was a shared analysis of what was wrong in the rental market and in this country's housing system. There was a shared vision for what needed to be better. There was shared commitment for what we were going to do about it. And there's some good shared organizing practice about how we were approaching actually going about organizing tenants into tenant unions. So many of these unions had worked together for a really long time, but we came together formally in 2024 to launch TUF. One of the first things that we did was kind of put our organizing practices together and create one that we then went ahead and tested, wasting no time at all. So we call our core methodology the steps to supermajority strike-ready tenant unions. And organizing heads on the call will be able to tell that what we're doing there is actually borrowing a lot from labor traditions. So I was trained as a community organizer. I currently identify as labor curious. And many of us, I think, have been exploring the ways that we can apply structure-based organizing to the tenant union context, which is not so different from the labor union context from which that tradition really grows. In fact, we see the tenant organizing potential in this century as very similar to the labor organizing potential at the beginning part of the 20th century, which is to say, we can organize people across race, across age, across geography, and in many ways across class, because the tenant class is not actually just one socioeconomic class, but contains a lot of multitude within. So that's some of what that's some of our origin story. And like I said, we didn't really waste time. We started organizing immediately once we had written some of this methodology down. We started to test it, and a lot of our work I would characterize as highly experimental, mostly because we are realists. We live in the real world, and we know that if someone had figured out tenant organizing, we'd be living in a very different world, actually, and we wouldn't be dealing with a lot of the problems that Greg and Luis and I just described. So we're approaching our organizing with an abundance of ambition, but also humility about what we don't know and what we need to try, and the ways that our organizing needs to look different today than tenant organizing has ever looked in order to meet the needs of our moment, where our landlords are bigger and more consolidated than ever. They're not really regulatable at the state level. Some of them are multinational actors. Most tenants don't have a damn clue who their landlord actually is. So there's a lot of challenges. And for that reason, we need to be diligent and rigorous and disciplined about our experimentation. So we took a couple of big early swings. The first one, we were embroiled in sort of years-long fights with the federal government, and specifically had zeroed in on the Federal Housing Finance Agency as the nation's top housing regulator. They oversee $150 billion in business with our landlords every year as the regulators of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And in many years of our lives that have been characterized by a Congress that kind of can't get anything done on housing or much else, we were really focused on what can we get done through regulatory or administrative authority. So that led us to the FHFA, where we were really focused on trying to get these loans that they give out to that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac give out to landlords. We wanted strings attached to that money because landlords get that money on really sweet terms that often don't come with many strings attached. So we wanted to attach some strings or conditions, including but not limited to rent regulations and eviction protections and other critical measures to keep tenants in their homes and in healthy homes. So that was one of our first big swings, and that led us to organize in a bunch of federally financed properties across the country. We took two of those properties on rent strike using this methodology. Both of those strikes happened in Missouri, where it's, I think, obviously not legal for tenants to withhold rent. And we were doing it in the most illegal fashion, in a sort of wildcat fashion. One of those strikes, 8 months later, after the tenants withheld $300,000 in rent, got us to the bargaining table with a new owner where we won a signed agreement, 2-year leases, rent reductions, eviction protections, and a schedule for major repairs. And along the way, we got millions of dollars from Fannie Mae paid out to those tenants. And best yet, they didn't owe a cent of the $300,000 that they had withheld back. So that was one kind of big test case. And that's one building in Independence, Missouri. So there was a lot more to do. We spent all of last year organizing across one corporate landlord's portfolio. This is the Capital Realty Group portfolio. They're a New York-based corporate landlord, and we ended up launching 9 unions across 6 states in their properties, got to the bargaining table with the landlord. There's negotiations still ongoing, so the story is not over, but we learned a ton through that fight across state lines about what we can do about some of these landlords that, as I said, aren't really regulatable in a sort of local or state context anymore. And then another one of our big swings that I'm excited to report we're in the sort of early stage of our second round of is our big training, and it's called Union School. We launched this training last year. We had 347 participants from across the country, and we were sort of bringing them into our steps to supermajority, strike-ready union methodology. And that resulted in dozens of unions launching across the country, some of which got to the bargaining table with the landlord, signed collectively bargained leases, others of which are still organizing. And I truly mean in every nook and cranny of the country. That leads us to this year's Union School, where we just launched last week. We have 837 participants representing 131 cities, 39 states. And what that means is that at a minimum, by September, we could be organizing in 26,250 units of housing across the country. So that's huge, and it is still not big enough. What I always say in our trainings is what we're up to, it's pretty good, and pretty good is not freaking good enough. I'll spare you the cursing, but if you're a tenant on one of my trainings, you're hearing the kind of full uncensored version of that. It's not good enough. Our knives are sharper than they've ever been before, but what we're up against is a team of landlords with more power than ever. Their knives are so much larger than ours. They're not even using knives. They're using other kinds of weapons, and it's not good, and our people are in tons of pain. So to kind of get back to what Greg was talking about before, our vision is not that we will be organizing building by building, block by block, and then suddenly we'll catch up to the landlords and we'll win. The horizon is not just signed agreements with landlords across the country. The horizon is a system that actually guarantees our homes as public goods and as human rights and moves away from the current system that, as Greg correctly assessed, treats our homes actually as commodities or investments and treats our lives as line items in our landlords' budgets. So way back in 2018 and 2019, a crew of tenants I was organizing with at the time started articulating a vision for what this could look like in terms of national and even federal policy and defining a vision for social housing. So housing permanently and completely off of the private market, not available for investment and speculation. And there's kind of 3 core components of how we envision social housing. One is governance. Our proposed governance structure is designed to ensure that tenants have the loudest voices in determining where and how they will be housed. And in an ongoing way, they're in the room and in the mix in a sort of major way in determining how that housing is governed. It's designed to ensure that tenants have power and oversight on all activities related to what goes on in social housing. And it's designed to ensure that not just in the beginning, but forever onwards, people come before profit in this model. So the first component is governance. The second component that's really important to us is funding. The funding structure we propose would channel funding away from institutions that disproportionately harm our communities and into systems that will heal. And specifically, what we're talking about here is public funding. We think that's a cornerstone of social housing, is we want public funding, public financing. We want to be able to protect that in perpetuity. Philanthropic dollars aren't going to cut it. They could go away at any time, right? We want to build this into the way that we think about policymaking in this country at every level. And then the third component of how we think about social housing is programs. So we propose programs that would actually proactively protect tenants' rights, keep tenants securely housed for a long time on long-standing leases, build power among poor and working class tenants, and in relationship to the other powers that be that run the social housing programs, and really create a sort of new foundation and an alternative to the private market as it currently exists. So I'm going to drop into the chat the Kansas City version of this vision. This is several years old, so I'll just say that up front. But it's a really beautiful document that was created by a bunch of tenants in Kansas City and reflects some of that national vision for social housing again. And I'll let you go through that on your own time, but it is gorgeous, and I hope you check it out and let me know what you think. And caveat, it's a little old at this point. I want to get into what some of the sort of live issues are related to social housing, and this speaks to one of the questions I saw in the Q&A around scale. I think one of the biggest challenges with social housing and talking about social housing in the United States context today is we don't have good examples of what this looks like, and certainly not in the way that we've envisioned social housing could look in this country. The biggest example, the best example that many people cite is Vienna's social housing. So a 100-year running experiment, more than an experiment, an extremely successful model of housing that exists off of the private market. And it's also, by the way, beautiful. And the architects who build it fight over these contracts with the government because it's such a lucrative and important and critical role to fill in Vienna. That's not particularly helpful in a US context because many people's eyes glaze over when you talk about something in a country that's not ours and doesn't carry a lot of the baggage that we have here in an American context. The good news is, since we started articulating a vision for social housing, there are actually many examples of US cities and counties that have taken steps in this direction, I think coming from the same place that we come from, which is a recognition that something's got to give. The system that we have right now is not working. The system that treats our housing as commodities is a failure. It's a catastrophic failure. So in places like Seattle, Chicago, Montgomery County, you've seen in recent years cities pass legislation that moves in the direction of social housing. You've seen pilot programs that begin to take us there. That is all well and good. And it leads me to what I assess as some of the biggest issues at play with social housing right now. One is that the term social housing has started to mean not that much at all because people are using it in a lot of different ways to describe everything under the sun, from mixed income market rate housing to public housing, like straight up historic public housing, and then many third and fourth other things. So there's a sort of diminishing utility of the term social housing until and unless we commit to a shared definition of what we mean. What I described is what we think of as social housing, which is really like municipal and federal supported housing. The second big issue that I would identify when I think about examples like Seattle and Chicago right now is an issue that I guess I'm characterizing as endurance. in some ways, our politics are out ahead of our organizing on this issue. So, in places where there's political space for it, we've passed social housing ordinances, but we don't have a base that's strong enough to actually build social housing in the way that we need it and then sustain it. Social housing is an intervention in a profit-driven housing model. If we think our enemies, our opponents, the people making profit off our homes are just going to let this happen, we've got another thing coming. So it's actually sort of mission critical that the organizing catches up with the politics on this issue. Otherwise, that term is going to become even more useless, and it's basically just going to be a catch-all that helps make room for more quote unquote affordable subsidies and tax credits at the local level. So I think there's a big issue around endurance and the kind of politics of this of the social housing debate right now. And then I think the third major issue is scale. So the thing about social housing in the way that we're talking about it, we want it to be like a Marshall Plan for housing, an entirely different way of doing things. That requires us to get to a level of scale. We are not asking for pilots and we're not trying to tinker at the margins. We actually need an intervention that houses thousands of people in a city like Kansas City and then millions of people across this country. When we defined a national vision for this in 2019, we called for 12 million units of social housing. I would argue we probably need to up that figure by a factor of 2 times or 3 times at this point, given the nature of the economy now. So scale is a major problem, which leads me to my fourth and final problem that I'll share with you, which is financing. So one of the big issues that maintains the status quo is that the math just doesn't work for for a private developer that quote unquote needs to turn a profit for their investors. The math doesn't work for them to optimize for rent that's actually affordable for people to live. We also need to be concerned with the math. Just because we're organizers who have like big, bold visions, it doesn't mean that we get let off the hook around figuring out housing finance. So that's a big challenge, and it's one that we're thinking about a bunch at every level, from the municipal level to the federal. What does it look like for us to actually build institutions or force the government in a different direction such that we have the financing we need to make the math make sense and make social housing what it could actually be, which is this large scale intervention? So the final couple things I'll say here is that I see us as in an era where we need to focus on building base everywhere, building muscle among tenant organizers and tenant unions that would create the conditions to win big. I think winning big means focusing federal for a lot of different reasons that I won't get into here. But primarily, I think because we're organizing in a lot of places where it actually may be easier to win federal than it is at the state level. And then I think we're also in an era right now where we can produce some good proof of concept that helps lay some of the groundwork that we would need in a kind of friendlier political context to move quickly federally. So the final thing I'll say is that I've been organizing at a property in the northeast of Kansas City called, well, we call it the North Lawn Tenant Union for 3 years. 3 years ago, the tenants went without heat on the coldest weekend of the year, and they quickly organized and kicked their slumlord out and got the heat turned back on. But a new slumlord from out of town bought the building, tried to evict everyone. They organized again. They said, we're not going anywhere. They fought, and they ended up winning an amazing deal with the city. They basically forced the city to intervene in a way the city never has before. And the tenants could only pay $400 and the landlord needed $850. So we got the city to come in on $450 per tenant household per unit for 2 years. So 2.5 years later, the city's still paying half the rents. And because the city was in on it, we got this agreement that secured a bunch of tenant protections. So we saw this as the beginnings of what proactive city intervention could look like. And we're back in this fight in the same property that is in extreme financial distress. The landlord is in way over his head. He has debts that he can't pay off, as many landlords do across the country. We are in a context right now where there's mounting financial distress in the multifamily rental market, which could lead to whole portfolio collapses And what happens to those portfolios when they collapse is a huge question that I think social housing could help solve if we're ambitious and if we have some of the financing in place. There are the loan delinquencies across the country nearly doubled in the last year alone. We're potentially hurtling towards crisis, and within that crisis could be a huge opportunity for intervention. So in the context of North Lawn in Kansas City, we're now asking the city to consider its role. Are you going to be a facilitator of yet another mass evacuation of a distressed property while a slumlord gets to sort of pack it up and go back to New Jersey? Or will you come in with us, proactively intervene, put a lien on this property, acquire it through eminent domain or another option, and actually embark on an experiment towards social housing with us? And it's not just in Kansas City, in places like New York City, where we have very friendly governing that has a lot of ambition on this issue. We're starting to call some of these questions too. What can be done proactively? What's the role of our municipal and other governments in helping to facilitate tenant takeovers and social housing at scale?
Thanks so much, Tara, and thanks to you all for your insightful remarks. We are now going to use our last 12, 13 minutes for some questions and answers. So I just want to start with a question that came in from an attendee that's for you, Luis. And the question is whether you can share additional details about Piedmont Community Land Trust's rent-to-own process. The attendee who posed the question noted that historically rent-to-own contracts or programs have been used to keep African Americans out of majority white exclusionary neighborhoods. People were generally set up to fail under these kinds of contracts, which were very often employed in majority Black communities, to be clear. With so few people currently being able to get together enough money for a down payment, the attendee is looking for equitable rent-to-own practices and would like to learn more. Can you share some details?
Yeah, absolutely. And I share your concerns because of the history. I worked at Legal Aid Justice Center and before, and we encountered issues with rent to own, where the own part is designed to just never happen. And so that's very true. We've done this once, and I think a big part of the reason is because of the issues that can come up. But some of the things that we did ahead to get us there is that before PHA acquired the home, we had a conversation with the residents of that home, see if number one, this is something that we're actually interested in, and number two, through Piedmont Housing Alliance, having them sit down with a housing counselor to determine what their range of affordability actually is, so we can plan before we officially enter the picture how we're going to help them get to that goal. And so to put some actual numbers behind it, that landlord who actually reached out to us in the first place because they could not afford to be landlords anymore, and they at least had the wherewithal to not want to displace the person, so they approached us first. They sold the home to us for $247. It was valued at $300, and that gave us a decent starting point to say, okay, this fund, we can pull some money from this fund, we can pull some money from this fund. Piedmont Housing Alliance has a down payment assistance program that can supplement, and if we set aside this percentage of rent, we'll be able to add it up to this much, and all of that together, how far down from 247 does that get us? It actually got us well below 180, which ended up being the sales price, but we ended up using that instead to significantly rehab the home. So we did new roof, new HVAC, new flooring, new cabinets. But I'm happy to put my contact if you want more details. But long story short, we had to be very intentional heading into it and make sure we're involving the residents in that decision too, because otherwise, yes, it's very easy to get into a trap.
Thanks, Luis. And I just posted something in the chat for everyone that's just a little refresher on the predatory and harmful rent-to-own schemes that really negatively impacted Black communities in the 50s, 60s. And then we're now seeing, unfortunately, some areas of the country where those kinds of contracts are reemerging. Thanks, Tara, for that notice. We will quickly move on to a question I think that you can hop in on as well. We talked a little bit about, and Tara, you did this in your remarks, kind of the scalability question, but I really just want to zero in on one part of the question from the attendee who posed this. And we've talked a lot about one C word, right, which is commodity and commodification. But there's another one I think that comes up. And so the question is this sort of fundamental source of housing unaffordability and inequity, this commodification, is this just a part of the system, a part of the capitalist system within which we live? And how are you all sort of navigating the need, right, for folks to be able to access housing with this larger issue of living within this capitalist system? I know that's a huge question. Anyone have just thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, easy. Yeah, I mean, I think what I can share is the way that we think and talk about decommodification is a total intervention in the way that our economy is structured. And I think that's, yeah, so we're very explicit about the way that we're organizing in opposition to the system as it functions today. We have a training tomorrow night with our union school participants that's about the landlord-tenant contradiction and housing as the infrastructure of American racial capitalism. And, we do that kind of training with our folks all the time. I don't know exactly if this is part of what you're asking, Kashana, but at least I'll answer as an organizer. What we don't do is knock on a door railing about the evils of capitalism. We just haven't found that to be particularly effective, as you might imagine. It is totally effective with plenty of people, and for still other plenty of people, plenty of households across the country, the main concern is the mold in the bathroom that's making their kids sick. The main concern is how they have to make a choice every month between putting food on the table and paying the rent. So, of course, the big concern is with our economic system and the way that it's structured. And, no matter how you want to characterize it, the thing that we encounter at doors is that people know that is wrong. And our role as organizers is to ask people questions, listen to them deeply, and invite them into something. And then within the tenant union, it's almost inevitable that in a matter of weeks or months, people get a political education. And, we've got trailer park residents in Montana railing against the evils of American racial capitalism and whatnot. But, we see our role as organizers as primarily around uniting people along the lines of connection that they share, mostly their material interests. And we don't actually lead with ideology, and that's kind of on purpose.
I actually think that was a perfect answer. So thank you. Greg or Luis, anything that you want to add to that? Uh-oh, Luis, you're not coming through for me. I don't know if that's an
Wrong
issue for
device.
anybody else.
Thank
There we
you.
go. Okay.
Yeah, I will add that no model in and of itself is gonna scale to the issue. It's the movement that's gonna be the key, and that's where like Tara's work is very important, because the community land trusts were born out of movements and have grown out of movements. If there's no movement to say all land needs to come out of the speculative market, then it's just not going to happen. So to me, it's less a technical question because there's so many models out there that could work, and it can exist at the same time even of like the models in and of itself. It's more of a question of like, are we willing to act as militantly as we need to and build the movements that are necessary to get there.
Thanks so much. And I do want to let you all know that Tara mentioned that she needed to jump off the call. She had something come up. And so she offers her thanks to everyone. In our last few minutes, I am going to pose one question, and then we may have time for a final one. But we have a question about the faith community, the role of the faith community. And Greg, I would love for you to start us off with your thoughts on this one. Can anyone talk more about the role of the faith community in helping to create housing that is affordable for all communities? While the attendee notes that this wouldn't necessarily solve the problem, is the faith work to be done inadvertently allowing the business and political leadership to slow down since someone else is stepping up to help? Greg, any thoughts there?
I think that faith communities, I mean, roughly we could say kind of two different roles that they could play. One, and I think Jennifer there is from Charlotte and attends a church that's done some really cool work of repurposing some of their space into housing for men that were formerly on the street. So there are lots and lots of congregations that have opportunities like that with unused land, unused building space that can be repurposed. I think that whether those efforts let somebody off the hook or not, is the answer to that is how we're using those same congregations to organize for better, larger society, citywide, statewide solutions. So there are plenty of other examples in our history of churches and synagogues and masjids and other faith groups organizing people for the purpose of social movements. And so I think that our faith communities ought to be in that same business as well, just as anti-war movements have been in the past, or the civil rights movement probably most prominently. So I think we have multiple roles to play.
Thanks so much, Greg. So with our last couple of minutes, I'm going to ask both Luis and Greg to please share your contact information in the chat. I know that there are some specific questions that either or both of you probably could chime in, but we just don't have enough time to get into that. With our last few moments, I do want to just note that we had a really great question come through about whether there are any concerns with an affordability movement that's hyper-focused on class-based solidarity, as opposed to a movement that also recognizes the unique role and experience of racialized populations. And I think that's a really critical point. In certain sort of camps, there is a lot of conversation about the need to sort of either eradicate poverty or organize around class, as opposed to recognizing the racialization of our housing system. And Redress has a very specific and clear perspective on that. I'm going to ask that one of my colleagues please share in the chat our principles for redressing segregation that you can find on the Redress website. But from our perspective, we always at the Redress movement center race in our work. And in fact, our work really rejects the idea that addressing classism or organizing specifically around class would lead to equitable life outcomes and resolve the harms caused by residential segregation. For example, we know that Black college graduates across the country have less wealth than white college dropouts, right? And so it's not about income or class there, but that disparity is linked to the fact that African Americans historically were excluded from home ownership, which we heard from Greg, and I think most of us know has long been the primary driver of wealth across the United States. And so from our perspective, it's really important to take that history and that understanding into account. So I did just want to briefly address that. I'd like to thank you all all for joining us today. We understand what it means for you to spend time during your busy afternoons with us. And so we are so grateful for your participation and your attendance today. I would also like to thank our ASL and Spanish language interpreters. Thank you again to our incredible panelists, and thanks to my colleagues at the Redress movement for bringing this conversation to you all today. With that, we hope to see you at the next Lessons from the Field webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.